So hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Shahan Pereira. I'm the content manager at Social Enterprise UK, and we're delighted to be joined this afternoon by Yvonne Field, CEO and founder of the Ubele initiative. We're going to be talking about some of the incredible work that they do, the continued impact of the pandemic, and also a bit about the Black Lives Matter movement and the continued fight for racial equality. Thank you so much for joining us, Yvonne, and for taking the time out of your busy calendar to speak to our audience today. Before we start, just a bit about I was going to say housekeeping, but you can't really say that when we're all in our own houses. A bit about the format of the interview. We'll have sort of a 30 to 40-minute conversation, which will be followed by some time for questions. If you do have a question, please submit it via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get back to them after the interview. So hi, Yvonne, thank you again.
Thank
How
you.
are you today?
Oh, no, I'm really good, Shahan. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to yourself and your colleagues and all the businesses that you support through Social Enterprise UK.
No worries. I guess to start off with, it would be great to find out just a little bit more about yourself and your own story and what inspired you to set up Ubele.
Sure. So, my professional background of many decades ago is community development and youth work. So I trained professionally actually about 40 years ago or so a long time ago. I've always been interested in social justice and social change. I suppose my very early story around how you can and should really try and intervene into systems when you experience discrimination was when I was 11. My mother actually campaigned against the local education authority. I wasn't offered a school place that we thought we should be offered, and all my white friends who decided to apply to the same school as me did, they got a place.
Wow.
So rather than taking second best, we campaigned, and I was homeschooled for 3 months with Black students and Black activists in my parents' front room, and lots of local media cover and letters back and forth through the Race Equality Council to the Education Authority meant that I eventually went to school in January and went to a better school than I'd actually applied for in the first place. So that was my very early
So that
first
inspired you.
foray into, you can just say, no, this isn't good enough, actually. And I think in this case, my parents thought that their daughter was entitled to a better education that was being offered. So, we campaigned. So I learned about that when I was 11. So always, since then, been a bit of an
Always
activist.
campaigning. That's
Yeah,
brilliant. I mean,
and
going off on a tangent, I guess. I don't know if you saw the Steve McQueen series.
yes, I did. I saw some of it. I've
Yes,
not
and
seen
the
all of
last
it,
one
but
on
yes,
the last episode on education seems to very
yes,
much resonate with
yeah,
your
absolutely.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I also come from a family of entrepreneurs. So there are 10 of us. I've got 9 siblings, and 8 of us have all been involved in some kind of business venture, employed people, set up companies. So I had a consultancy and training company for nearly 15 years before Ubele started, and I'm the only one in the social enterprise field. They're all sort of builders, carpenters, photographers, media people, running businesses, catering, and all sorts of things.
Mm.
But I suppose enterprise is in our blood and our DNA. So, we were kind of, my sense of being able to do things for ourselves and being slightly outside of the mainstream. I mean, I've worked in local government, I've worked internationally, I've worked within the mainstream system, but actually I think I'm a person who likes to set things up and grow them from seed, really.
Nice. I guess what struck me about Ubele, just through looking at what you do and through your membership of Social Enterprise UK, is that you just do so much across so many different kind of areas. Could you give us just a quick overview of some of the things that you do? Because your mission is to help build more sustainable communities across the UK. Could you tell us a bit more about
Yeah.
how you go about doing that?
Yeah, so Ubele started as a series of conversations, actually, in dialogue in mainly communities that were mainly in South London, which is where I was born and brought up. And so, I was just really curious about the fact that our parents had come, in my case, from Jamaica in the Caribbean in the 50s and had always wanted to go back home. But then 3-4 generations later, we were still here. So it felt like that plan didn't really work. They've both passed away. They passed away here. And so really, I was curious about what should be a plan B if we are going to stay here. Some of us may go back to Caribbean, Africa, other parts of the world, but there was also, especially in my family, we're a very culturally diverse family, that, you know, some people are definitely, you know, more Black British, where some of us kind of really much more connected to our African ancestry. I've got family living in, my sisters and nephew live in mainland, you know, in Africa, in Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya and so on. So those, out of those conversations, we started hearing a few things coming up, really. The need for a new generation of community leaders. We needed to think about what we would need to do to support, how could we support our young people? We need to think about the needs of our elders. And so we have grown this organisation and this social business through being still very rooted in communities. And we say that our mission is around community wealth building. And that came about through people being our biggest asset, but also we were hearing that we were losing community spaces, and that there was a need for, you know, sort of more sustainable model to bring some of the spaces we still had back into usage, and to kind of bring them, you know, into being fit for the 21st century, because some of them were given to our communities in the 70s and early 80s after certain uprisings and, you know, sort of particular kind of, you know, sort of talking to local governments about what the needs were and being quite strong and quite forceful about those needs being met. But some of those spaces were needed serious sort of overhaul. So we wrote a report in 2015 called A Place to Call Home, where we used digital mapping and did lots of interviews about some of those spaces around the country. And that really gave us a platform for thinking about asset development through enterprise. So having more of a sustainable model, a mixture of grants and loans and enterprising activities. And so we operate at 4 levels really now. We operate very much still in communities. We're community based. We have, we're co-stewards of a 3.5 acre growing and community site in Haringey, where I live now, Wolves Lane Horticultural Centre, which is amazing. Nice. We're also involved in developing a Black-led community space in Brixton, the Lloyd Leon Community Centre, that was given to the Black community after the uprisings in 1981. It's the 40th anniversary, actually, of those uprisings in April this year. And we also, in February, became the infrastructure group, the BAME infrastructure group for London. We were appointed in February just before COVID, which is just in time, because there wasn't actually a BAME infrastructure group for London before we were appointed that had any financial resource to do the work. So we had to step into that gap in March, April, when COVID, you know, was really sort of ravaging our communities. And then over the last few years, we've developed a strategic relationship with Power to Change. And again, in February this year, we were asked to become a strategic partner officially, along with Social Enterprise UK and a number of other organisations, locality. And so we were asked to be involved in some of the COVID response this past year. And in the international space, in fact, before we became regional and national, we actually were local and international, because we've done and we still do a lot of international capacity building projects through the Erasmus programme, which unfortunately has ended now that we're out of Brexit, but we've still got funding for another 2 years of different capacity building programmes, where we take groups of change makers and activists to different parts of Europe to do all sorts of training, appreciative leadership, action learning, art of hosting, those kinds of programmes we can offer groups and individuals to come on in different parts of Europe. So we're local, regional, national and international. That was always a vision, actually, because we are diaspora people, so we will always have international links and connections, but we're community developers, so we're rooted in communities, and we're entrepreneurs, so all of it sort of fits together. So as I said, community wealth building is our mission.
But across,
so
many different fields,
dimensions.
across all the dimensions.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you work with communities, I guess, because you are very much rooted within the communities that you work with, of how do you engage with and help develop, so I guess co-develop some of these projects?
So, I mean, you know, it's a complex process. Working with communities is never easy. So one of the projects that we're developing at the moment at Wolves Lane is a Black-led growing group and a food growing group. And so that will become a small business. And so Black Roots, spelled ROOTZ, came together as a result of changes that were being made at Wolves Lane. We heard that the growing side, which we didn't really pay too much attention to because we're not growers in Ubele, there were some changes, and it meant that a couple of the black growers would probably have to leave the site. And we said, well, that can't happen. We're not going to allow that. So we said, let the black growers come together with other black growers, because we have a history of food growing, but often in allotments and community gardens, not at scale, and not to scale, and not taken to market in a sort of collective way. So we've been working with Black Roots over the past year and a half to develop that initiative. And then we've just got some funding to roll that out, scale it up and roll it out. So it's food growing and horticultural training. And it will be in 3 London boroughs as a test, as a sort of pilot, and that will be generating and bringing together the next generation of food growers, but from Black and minority ethnic communities. So as you can imagine, when you're working as an individual grower, an individual in a community, bringing people together, working together is always a challenge, because you're used to kind of working on your own. And also just sort of introducing processes and ideas around business and sort of enterprise, as opposed to just growing, I say just growing for self and family and so on. So those kind of dynamics are always coming into play. It takes a lot of interrelationship, building really, strong relationships with people, listening to their stories, kind of responding to needs as they emerge. Walking beside, I mean, we've got some ideas about what could happen, but you can't, our role is not to push people or to pull people, it's actually to guide them and to ask really, sort of critical questions about what is it that they want to do, what skills do they need, what skills do they have, how can they share those skills with others? Because within Black Roots, there are growers who have been growing for 30, 40 years, incredibly skilled and knowledgeable people, and actually using them also as mentors and as leaders, but also recognizing that younger people who are really into the environment and food and healthy lifestyles also need to kind of come into the leadership role as well in that organization, and ultimately that business.
Yes,
We're just
I love that
developing
phrase, walking alongside. That's a really good way to put it.
and it's complex, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to be really sort of have an intention which is to really support, as opposed to, as I said, coming in as the expert, because the expertise is shared. We were talking about this earlier this week, actually. We had a sort of Ubele gathering of associates and staff at the beginning of this week, and we were talking about, what does it mean to be authentic in our leadership style, but actually, where does the expertise lie? And, we're working with people in communities who've been rooted in those communities for decades. Some of their families have been there, for decades before them and so on. And so they know what's going on. They know what the needs are. Sometimes they just need access to different kinds of resources and guidance, and for someone to listen to them and to actually empower them to act on their ideas.
Brilliant. So I guess the 2 biggest stories of last year, of 2020, have undoubtedly been the devastation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we had this incredible mobilization against racial injustice that we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, I think it's still got momentum behind it. It's something we'll come back to later. But I think it became really clear, didn't it, really quickly, that these 2 events, the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, were fundamentally linked. And I remember doing some research before our chat, just looking at some of the ONS data, which basically just proves that COVID-19 isn't something that affects everybody equally, and it's a virus that very much does discriminate. And we've seen this in the stats showing that if you're Black, you're 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19, which is just such a horrific statistic. And I guess it showed that the pandemic, the impacts of it kind of layered onto pre-existing inequalities. Like if you're from a minority ethnic background, you're more likely to not be able to work from home. You're more likely to live in an area that's densely populated. So with these same systemic issues of health, wealth, employment, housing, raised by BLM, resulting in a disproportionate number of Black and other minority ethnic people dying. I guess given that you're so rooted in these communities, I guess you really found yourself at the forefront of both supporting communities through the pandemic, but also campaigning for change and to bring these issues kind of into the mainstream. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing to support communities through this incredibly difficult time, and also maybe a bit about the We Need Answers campaign, which is really interesting.
Sure. So in terms of supporting communities, I think because we were appointed as a sort of BAME infrastructure group for London in February, and we had a mission to focus on community assets and wealth building with 12 organisations in London, we had to leave that. We had to put that to one side and really step into this gap when COVID really exploded in London and across the country. And so one of the first things we did was actually sort of try to find out what the impact would be in relation to Black and minority ethnic community organisations. And so we did a piece of research. It was a quick and dirty piece of research. We didn't realise that it would have the impact that it had, but basically from the organisations that responded, about 130 in total, 9 out of 10 of them said they were on the brink of closing because the sector had been really, really weak in terms of investment, not in terms of activity. People were doing work in spite of not having financial investment, but actually the extra demands on them, by the people, the communities they were serving on the front line, meant that they were really under threat. So we did the research, and then we were able to use that to secure resources to do a whole range of capacity building and support activities. So we did last year, May to August, we did a whole host of funding exercises, webinars. We had weekly webinars with all the different funders that had emergency funding for COVID. They came and spoke. We gave support around writing proposals and doing, financial templates and proposals and putting together people's ideas. We gave a lot of one-to-one support. We also had a whole host of events. I mean, we just opened a space for conversations around COVID, around the impact on employment, around the impact on health and well-being, and so on and so forth. We also set up with Patrick Vernon, who's a very well-known social activist. We set up the Majonzi Fund, which is a fund which actually has raised over £80,000, and that's to provide bereavement support, counselling support, and also we haven't given money for the second part yet, but we will, small grants for Memoria, so that actually, if people want to remember loved ones, they can have a small grant to do things like maybe plant a tree or buy, something like that. We also, we've done a number of pieces of research, actually. We did a rapid review of the impact of COVID on those groups with protected characteristics. So we looked across all the research that was done in London. This was done for the GLA, came out last October, across all the different equality issues and groups that had actually spoken to their frontline staff, their staff and organisations, to see what the themes were that came out of, that were kind of cross-cutting. And they, no surprises, economic, health, digital exclusion, and so on were areas that came up very clearly. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, Shihan, I've had COVID, my daughter has, my brother was on a ventilator. We've now got staff who've got a number of deaths as a result of COVID during this wave that we're currently in. And so we were dealing with, as an organisation, the impact of COVID on us personally, as well as within the wider community, and obviously within our families. So we kind of had that we were trying to balance, those two sort of things that were playing out at the same time, which was really, really challenging. Just checking some of the other things we did. Some of the things we've been doing, I mean, as a result of the work that we did earlier last year and towards the end of the year, we're now supporting, we've got a new programme that we've just launched till the end of March. It's like 3 months of support to Black and minority ethnic organisations and social businesses through what we're calling Mali Enterprising Leaders England. Mali is another Swahili word. Ubele is from Swahili, which means the future, the way ahead. Mali is a word, it's obviously name of a country, but it also means precious or of value. So we've taken it to be someone or something of value and precious to our communities. So Mali Enterprising Leaders is a national programme, and we're going to be supporting over 80 groups in the next 3 months looking at what their needs are in terms of capacity building, then focusing on those needs. We've got teams of associates working with them. And the last major area that we did, apart from funding support, was to get involved in developing funding programs. So through conversations across the country with infrastructure organizations, we set up the Phoenix Fund with through lottery money. Global Fund for Children worked in collaboration with us. Ubele acted as the convener, the national conveners, and then we had participatory grant making with the infrastructure groups and anchor organizations. 18 people and organizations were on 6 panels that came together to make decisions. So we gave away just over £2 million through that route. And the other major piece of funding that we've been involved in is the community-led organizations response fund for COVID, and that program unearthed, as well as actually Phoenix Fund, but unearthed about 1,400 groups. Both of them had very similar numbers actually, which was interesting. And we gave away £9.5 million to those not to 1,400 groups, to about just under 400 groups got funding and support. The support now is happening to those groups that got funded, and so, you know, we gave up to £20,000 with the Clause programme, and up to £20,000 with the Phoenix Fund, and sort of unrestricted funding. So that funding was often a lifeline to organisations.
Just to keep people going,
to keep them going. In terms of the campaign, We Need Answers, that came about because Patrick Verner, I mentioned earlier, is a internationally renowned campaigner. So when we were kind of, you know, sort of really hit with the disproportionate impact of COVID on our communities, and actually his brother-in-law died as a result of COVID. He was under 60 actually, which is so sad. He said, Yvonne, why don't you start a petition? So we started the petition on I started the petition on 38 Degrees, saying, actually, this is, you know, we're so outraged by this, what's happening. And the government was just floundering, was just all over the place. You know, you could just see all these images on the news and in the news media and so on, as to who was being impacted, you know. So we started a campaign saying we wanted an independent public inquiry. I'd never done anything like that before in terms of, you know, sort of doing an online petition. And we ended up with over 30,000 signatures on that petition. And then we had a group of young activists come together under Ubele and decided to sort of drive forward that campaign. And so Lee Day, the solicitors, kind of approached us and said, can we help? How can we help you to kind of, you know, we're human rights lawyers. And so we wrote to the government. We actually sort of put the petition aside and we wrote to the government, and we wrote, you know, and said on the grounds of which we wanted to push them for an independent public inquiry. Actually, what was really interesting, they asked for more time to respond. They eventually responded with a 10-page letter, which Lee Day said was unheard of. They'd never seen that.
10-page letter from the government, not your usual just one-sided.
No, it wasn't. They really took it, somehow they took it seriously. I don't know what they heard about us, but they took it seriously. And so then they wrote back, and Lee Day sort of wrote back to them and questioned a number of their arguments. However, we got to the point where we thought, is this going to fly or not? How far can we push this? And as you will know, independent inquiries take a long amount of time, and, you know, like years and years and years. However, what we've done is we've actually then aligned ourselves with the families, because the families are all of the bereaved families of those who are dead. There's now a campaign around that. So Lee Day advised us that we align ourselves with that group, because actually they're pushing for an independent inquiry. And actually within that group, of course, it's disproportionate BAME families because of the impact.
So it's pooling resources.
So that's where we've got to with the campaign, that we're actually working alongside that group. Yeah, so my colleagues who are involved in that are doing that. But I mean, it just, and you know, we wrote the letter, when we wrote the letter to the Prime Minister, the original letter saying that we wanted this independent inquiry, we managed within 48 hours to get over 80 really high profile signatures. And now that letter has over 600 signatures on it. And in fact, the Museum of London, we've given it to the Museum of London. because they want to use it as a centerpiece of an exhibition they eventually will, what they will develop around COVID and also the disproportionate impact on BAME communities in London. So they asked if that letter could be given to them as a sort of central piece through which to tell the story of what's happened. So we were delighted to say, absolutely, this letter needs to be, it's part of the history of what's happening and happened during this period. So they've got the, you know, they've got the actual letter itself.
That's really interesting. I guess, like, yeah, where do you see that campaign now going? I guess because it's such an important thing to be shouting about and raising awareness about. Like, but you said, like you said, these inquiries can take forever and ever. Is it about just raising the profile and making sure that those statistics and those figures are always there and they cannot be ignored?
No, I think, well, yes, as that, but also I think that, you know, we've decided that we're going to support the families because actually they're the ones who, you know, who've lost, and yeah, actually it's interesting. I was thinking about my colleague who's lost all these family members just recently, and actually she and her family will now be in that group as well. So actually, in terms of the push for the independent inquiry, we've not dropped that. We will not drop that. And actually it strengthens the case for it, the fact the families are going to be leading on that, but actually we want it also to look at, you know, not just those that have died, but those who are impacted, because we know people have, you know, long-term, you know, conditions as a result of COVID, as well as, you know, that, you know, in terms of things like, you know, losing jobs, losing homes. I mean, it's just, the impact just has so many layers to it. I mean, it's a bit like a, you know, we talked about onions earlier, a bit like an onion. It's got different layers and layers and layers to it, and rings.
And we're still
so
figuring out kind of the long-term impacts, aren't we? Because I think that was the real thing about COVID. We just nobody really knew anything about it.
Exactly. So and still learning. You know, yesterday I was hearing about, you know, those people who've got the antibodies, how long they think it's going to last, and can they get it again? And so it's just all kind of, you know, it's all just, yeah, it's so new in terms of understanding it. So no, we haven't, you know, we will be still involved in this campaign. I think just the focus will be slightly different because we want to actually give support where we think we, you know, it's going to be effective. So no, we're definitely still in there, and we will be pushing this, supporting those who have been impacted. Oh, definitely.
Brilliant. To go back to the other stories around sort of the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes.
What would we get to sort of get your feelings on kind of, if we go back to May and just that incredible kind of surge in kind of, you know, these demands to actually get things changed. But how do you feel we can keep the momentum behind the campaign going? Because I've been thinking about this quite a bit actually, probably over the Christmas holidays, when you just find yourself thinking about wider things when you're kind of isolating at home. And I guess to me, what was really important about Black Lives Matter was it really did look at kind of the systemic existence of racial inequality, and the need to kind of tackle what's going on in workplaces, in the criminal justice system, when it comes to you know, have pay and employment and things like that. But I was also thinking we've also had this big narrative. You know, this may sound very waffly, so bear with me, but it does sound very waffly. But I suppose that's, you know, we've had this kind of media narrative that's been building around this kind of culture wars, and the things you see on the news, it tends to be stuff like around like the last night of the proms, for example. And there's this kind of like, and it's important, obviously. Another great thing about the Black Lives Matter movement was how it was very much looking at how these inequalities are rooted in our history and in our past. But there was an article by somebody in The Guardian, by an activist, saying that, you know, when we went out marching, there was nobody with a banner saying, let's stop singing Land of Hope and Glory. So you get the feeling that the discussion is moving away from the systemic injustices and the kind of the material things that need to change to potentially this focus on maybe gestures, and maybe also, you know, kind of companies changing their Instagram logo to be like a black square, and that being like, you know, part of the campaign, but those same companies maybe, you know, paying garment workers next to nothing in a factory in the global south while saying that Black Lives Matter. So I guess it's like, how do we keep focus on the big issues around the Black Lives Matter campaign and keep that momentum going so it doesn't kind of get lost in these wider, almost simpler kind of debates that we kind of see on the news.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, I mean, one thing that we can do, and this, as you were talking, I was thinking this year is also a really important year for Black British activism around racial injustice. As I mentioned, we have the uprisings that started in Brixton and then was actually, was catalysed across the country. So Toxteth and Handsworth and Halls and other places. It's a 40th anniversary of that moment in time, and there's going to be certainly there's an organisation that's been developing for the last 3 years an initiative called 81 Acts, and there's going to be 81 acts of defiance in Brixton and hopefully in the other cities as well.
Wow.
Yeah, that actually is about saying we need to remember this time, what's changed since that in 40 years, and actually we demand to be heard and for action to be taken. The other thing is this weekend, well, Monday actually, is a 40th anniversary of the New Cross fire.
Right.
And when 14 young people in New Cross died, were burnt, and died. And one died 2 years, in fact, it was 13, I think, at the party, and one died 2 years later because he committed suicide. I mean, the impact.
Was that a birthday party?
Yeah, it was a 16th birthday party, Yvonne Ruddock, yeah. So, I mean, both those events were 1981. And the reason why I mention them is because although the New Cross fire has had 2 inquiries, that came out saying it was not a racist attack, there has been, so over the decades, as we've tried to delve into what happened, the inquiries and the questions and the distress and so on, the sort of racist overtones within what was around that event is still very much part of the narrative. And obviously Brixton and all that happened there, that was because a Black young man how he was arrested by the. So, we still have stop and search disproportionately, being used. We still have, school exclusions. We have all these things that still are absolutely systemic examples of systemic racism within our society. The issue about, so how do we ensure that this new wave, and I'm old enough because I was 20 in 1981, so I remember New Cross fire, I remember the uprisings. I was training to be a community development worker up in Birmingham at the time, so this was all part of kind of my young history, or history as a young woman, and so for me, I think what's interesting, because as we went from the 80s onwards, the whole narrative around race and actually being able to call out institutional racism dissipated. When I was actually involved in activism in the 80s, 70s and 80s, we could talk about, and we did do anti-racist work. We could talk about racial inequality. We could talk about systemic racism. We could talk about institutional racism, although that term came later, particularly out of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. However, we did challenge it directly, and then over the 40 years, it all kind of became wishy-washy into diversity and, sort of other kind of terms that made everybody feel more comfortable, not disregarding the fact that lots of other groups experience inequality, discrimination, exclusion, and prejudice. But actually the use of the word race was actually kind of pushed under the carpet. It was felt to be and racism was felt to be too uncomfortable. What Black Lives Matter did was brought it very clearly back onto the agenda. Organisations are now individuals and organisations are talking about what does it mean to be anti-racist. Just even to mention the word racism is like, part of what the common nowadays at the moment. And is this just a moment in time? Will it become not so fashionable, as you were saying, kind of let's do these sort of tinkering around the edges and think that actually we've done the change that's needed? Definitely not. And for me, I mean, what I am noticing in some organisations that say that they're taking these issues seriously now, that for me, the question is, what's happening at your board levels? What's happening in your long-term strategy? Yes, of course, employment practices and how you work with local communities and so on, but actually, where are you trying to make the real change? And do you know, if you try and make the change and you're serious about it, things will change, which means that it's not business as usual for yourselves and your white colleagues. And are you ready for that?
It's
You
doing
know,
it for the long haul. Yeah.
I just heard yesterday that a charitable trust is bringing a number of new black staff are coming to the organisation. I'm like, so you're going to get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 new black staff. Do you really know what that might do to your nice little organisation? You know, and are you ready for that? And I want to be a fly on the wall, because I think there will be some interesting conversations, I'm being diplomatic here now, about what it means to actually change in the way that organisations work and operate, and their culture, and who's included, who's excluded, you know. And so I think that's for me is it interesting thing about Black Lives Matter, that it opened up a previously closed conversation, you know. And you know, I mean, you know, I just sort of think, I don't know where George Floyd is in the universe, but if he's looking down on us, his murder was not in vain, because it opened up a conversation, and an opportunity for people to step in and say, hell no, not on my watch anymore. And for me, it's like that opening up, it feels like it's still just about open. I'll be interested in what this year brings, both in terms of first anniversary and the other events and other global events that actually have systemic racism in the core, especially when it's an anniversary. I'm very optimistic about the young activists, you know, that their ability to organize, you know,
especially
mass
online
movements.
as well.
Absolutely.
Even
I mean,
just
it's
go to something
amazing.
like Instagram and the amount of knowledge sharing.
Exactly.
And
absolutely.
It's incredible.
No, I'm watching, you were talking about the Steve McQueen, you know, series recently. I was talking about it before we came online. And we're looking at the Mangrove 9 and watching Dark as How use Gestetner to produce leaflets and things. Those were things that, you know, this sort of ink that the police then came and smashed up the photocopy and so on and so on. But just watching the way we used to have to organize with, you know, very, very hard.
Endless pamphlets, was it?
Exactly, that you had to sort of literally turn on this machine called Gestetner, and you'd end up with all blue ink all over you and everything. It was a nightmare. But, you know, but now you can just, whiz something off. So my hopes are that the young activists continue to push and push and push and not take no for an answer. And a lot of the young activists that are involved in Frontline have, you know, they're reading, they're sharing knowledge, they're you know, engaging in inquiry and curious, and actually are very, very persuasive in their arguments. And I'm just like, yeah, go for it. I'm biggest cheerleader. We've got a lot of young activists around us, and I'm just their cheerleader. Certainly we are, yeah.
Very quickly, final question, because I would like to move on to the Q&A, because I think we've got 10 comments. So let me see, there probably are 10 questions, but we can't really not talk about the social enterprise movement in general and sort of the wider social enterprise community. And I think as a movement, as a social enterprise community, something that we're proud of is the fact that social enterprises tend to be more representative of society as a whole. And I think that the last bit of research we did, our State of Social Enterprise report in 2019, showed that 13% of social enterprises are BAME-led. But I guess just like any industry, there's systemic injustices within the social enterprise movement as well. What are your thoughts on what the wider social enterprise community could do better to support BAME-led businesses and sort of the wider fight for racial equality?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I've been talking with colleagues at Power to Change, at Access Foundation, at Unlimited, for example, over the last few months. And, you know, what is not clear, although you can see, you know, the percentage of BAME-led social enterprises within your membership or within the sector, it's still not clear. We still lack in intelligence about the nature of about the nature of these businesses. So what kind of sectors, how large or small are they? Because certainly with the funding that we've been involved in giving, which we knew before anyway, but we've been really supporting a lot of micro groups that have turnover of less than £50,000. So for me, I think that there's something about the social enterprise sector understanding the nature of the BAME-led sector within social enterprises, what their needs are, what their challenges are, huge issues. I mean, I've been in business since the 1990s. I've been in business for 25 years this year. I had a company limited by guarantee, which was a consultancy and training company. And I know the issues from there, and they are still absolutely within the sector, which is the social enterprise sector, which is about access to finance. So both in terms of loans, as well as some of the grant programs, we're just not, our communities are just not accessing those opportunities to grow. And also within the social enterprise sector, at least when I was in the sort of more private sector business area with consultancy and training, although I worked in the social system, so we're working with health, education, social care, and so on. But actually, where are the social enterprise advisors from our communities? I do know that we used to have social enterprise advisors that were from Black and brown communities, because there were lots of networks. And so I was involved in Black women in business and African Caribbean business network. Where are those networks and where are those advisors from our communities? Because we know if we're supporting, if I'm a business being supported by somebody who looks like me and understands what it is to develop and grow a business, there's an instant rapport. I can sometimes say things to that advisor that I wouldn't want to say to a white advisor, actually. I just wouldn't want to say it. But there's also understanding the ways in which we grow our businesses and also some of the markets that we're in. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who was saying that actually for investment purposes, social investors didn't want to give a Black woman who was doing hair products investment, because they didn't think there was a market. Well, actually, we know,
what?
There wasn't a market for Black women's hair products. Well, I think I've heard somewhere at a conference some years ago, when I was at a great conference in Spelman, somebody on the platform, Spelman College, one of the historically Black colleges in Atlanta, one of the speakers said Black women in America spend 9 times more on hair and skin products than white women do. And this panel of white men was saying, is there a market for Black women's hair products? And so
That's unbelievable.
it was just like ridiculous. So I think some of the assumptions about us and our businesses, and our business potential, our growth potential, and also just about who even within BAME communities, who are seen to be the more natural business people rather than others, even within our communities. There's all that sort of discrimination going on. So I think research, investment, support, and also, I'm really, because we're about community wealth building, I'm really, really keen to get businesses from the BAME community that work together. I mean, there's that old adage, you can go faster on your own, but you can go further together. We're really about trying to get small groups of people from our communities to work together on the business ideas and to develop them collectively, because I think you can go much further and you get different skills together. And it's a challenge sometimes, because obviously people have got different ideas, but I think that the sole trader, yes, that's one model for sure. And that's how people often start, particularly if you're working from home and setting up an idea. But I also think that we're quite interested in collaborative, businesses that kind of have a small group, 2, 3, 4 people. That's what we're about. That's what we're kind of interested in. But there are huge barriers, for BAME-led social enterprises, some of which I've outlined. And I think that just in terms of the social investment field, just a conversation about what is social investment. So basic, education.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds basic, but if you've not been part of that conversation, you would not know. Yeah. And one of the things that my colleagues, one of our directors have been doing, he runs a private company. He and a group of Black business leaders have actually developed a Black business manifesto. And so they've been talking with HSBC and other banks about what that means. And investment is one of there's 10 areas, but investment is one of them that they're really pushing on to make sure that Black-led businesses get the investment they need.
Brilliant. Lots to think about. I think let's probably end it there. I've got so much more. I mean, I kind of want to ask about your thoughts around a national infrastructure body, but let's see what the questions are, and then maybe we can go back to that. So we've got somebody who wants to know more about participatory grant making. I guess that's probably a reference to the Phoenix Fund, I think.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
I'd love to hear more about how you did participatory grant making and who is on the panels. How do you ensure community are involved in selection? Who is included and how? And any challenges in this process?
Yeah, I have to say that there's lots of different models of participatory grant making, for what I understand. And also have to say that, until last year, January, and this is the truth, people sort of say, what? But actually, Ubele didn't have any, the only grant aid we had last year, January, from the UK grant system was £10,000 from Awards for All. That shows a level of lack of interest and disinvestment in BAME-led initiatives in this country. So that's where we started last January when we got the £10,000, and then of course everything changed and blah, blah, blah. But so there are many models. The model that we used in the Phoenix Fund was one that was kind of built on or taken from the model that the Global Fund for Children used, because they were the ones that did the grant administration for us. So what we did was we looked at, and we also took into account the regions of the lottery, because the lottery has 6 regions and it was lottery money we were dispersing. So we took the 6 regions and we identified 12 people 2 from each of the regions. They were either leaders of running infrastructure groups, so like Black Southwest Network, Lancashire BAME Network, Manchester BAME Network, BRAP in Birmingham, and then an organisation in East Midlands, and so on and so forth. And also we made sure that there was a diversity of both in terms of cultural diversity within those 12 groups, as well as age and gender. Yeah. And then we also had some representation from Resourcing Racial Justice and Future Foundations, which are 2 organisations. Well, RRJ has been grant making. They gave money under COVID, people of colour. And then Future Foundations is made up of people who work within the foundations and charitable trusts. And then we had somebody from Global Fund for Children and from the lottery. So we had that kind of mix and spread. And first of all, I mean, this was very iterative. It was really iterative. I mean, we're trying things that didn't work. We brought everybody together to look at the applications we had. That was a bit disastrous because the group was too big. So then we decided to have 6 triage groups of 3 in each group of the 18. And then each of the triage groups would then send one person to a panel, having done their selection of their top 10 groups. And each of the 3 all came to a panel. So everybody came as a representative of their triage group to the panel of 6. So that was 6 threes at 18. And then we had representation from across the 6 groups into a panel. So we were very, very busy because it was we wanted to get the money out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, this is all working to quite a tight time frame, right?
Very, very, very tight time frame. I mean, weekly meetings. And I mean, the process of developing all this came from the field when I called people together that I'd met, and then they invited other people to meetings. We met with the head of the lottery, who's now left, and we made demands that we wanted to get money out quickly on the back of the report that we'd written about where the nature of our sector and the impact of COVID. So what was interesting was that, I mean, in terms of assessments, we had, as I said, nearly 1,400 applications through. And so in terms of assessments, those triage groups did the assessments and, as I said, sent the 10 through. Then at the chairs meeting, we had, there were conversations about the selections that they were made. There were challenges by other people from the other subgroups, and then decisions were made, adjustments were made about the money, because we always had more requests, even of from those 10 groups that we could give money to. And generally speaking, at the end of it, because we ended up with another £1 million, we started off with £1 million, we had another £1 million, we were able to basically give all 10 groups some money, generally speaking, between £5,000 and £15,000 per group that they got. It wasn't a precise science. We've got a learning partner working with us. We're still meeting because we're actually looking at Phoenix 2.0 for that to come on stream, hopefully later this year if the lottery decide that they want to support it. We've reported back to them. And so we're hoping, yeah, that we will have another program that's probably slightly refined from what we did, but it still will involve participatory grant making of a kind, and our learning partners helping us capture what's come out of the whole process.
But I guess the fact that came about so quickly is pretty incredible. So was the Phoenix Fund created directly in response to the research showing that 9 out of 10 businesses were at risk of shutting down? So you actually had a very tight time frame to.
That was a driver. That evidence was a driver, and so the lottery kind of accepted that was happening, and also that, you know, the voices from the field in terms of the infrastructure groups and the anchor organisations, they were also hearing that people needed to get money. And although there was lots of different funds out, some of the criteria, we had a very, very simple form. I think we had 13 questions, 6 of which were tick boxes, and the other 6 or 7 were like 200 words maximum. I mean, they were really very, very broad. And we obviously did due diligence, but again, that was kind of fairly light touch compared to what we're used to seeing. And it actually was a challenge for people on the panels to not revert to what had done to them. So actually said we could be light touch, we could have a simple form, they're like, can we do it like that? We're like, yes, we can. I was like, oh, okay, because they were used to such hurdles in funding and that for funding applications.
Brilliant. So we've got another question about what does it mean being the BAME infrastructure organisation for London? What does that mean in practice?
Yeah, well,
actually, how much time to do that because of COVID sort of just
exactly. So we're just looking
at
that now, and actually, we are also contesting the term BAME, but I'm using it here, and we're using it, but we know that that's a shifted. That's a word a term that will kind of go out the window. It's moving. There's a big conversation around it. So I'm always putting it in inverted commas. Okay. So as I said, what happened was we were appointed by the GLA in February to do a piece of work which meant we would be an infrastructure organisation providing support. We said at that time in January when we applied and appointed in February, to work with 12 organisations in London that have community spaces, and we would develop a model around leadership and enterprise to redesign those spaces and try and make them more sustainable than they were. Some of them were not sustainable at all. And then COVID happened, so we had to ditch that idea and step into this gap, massive gap. So we've been doing all the things I was saying around fundraising, funding support, getting money out, capacity building. We're working with about 40 groups in London at the moment till the end of March as part of this Mel England programme. We've got a London piece. Some of them have got some of them are setting up their own infrastructure for their boroughs, because London only has one infrastructure group at the moment that's BAME-led, which is in Croydon. I mean, a city with more than 40% BAME community having one infrastructure group and nothing for the whole of London is just a travesty as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand how that, well, I do kind of understand that, because we were not Flavour of the Month for many, many years anyway. So now what we're doing as part of our strategy for London is we're looking at focusing on, we can't focus on everything because it's just too big and the resources are really, really tight. So we're going to be potentially looking at working with 6 boroughs initially. So we've got someone who's looking at how might we develop a model with 6 boroughs. We have strong connections. I'm based in Haringey with the Wolves Lane Centre. We're doing work in Lambeth with the Brixton Centre. We're doing work in Lewisham. We've been working with them for quite a while actually. And then Southwark have approached us. Potentially, Camden's also approached us to work with 30 of their BAME organisations during this period, and potentially Newham or Tower Hamlets, an East London borough, would be the initial 6. And so the idea is to come up with a model to work with them, to provide capacity building, information, areas that we're working on in terms of kind of specific health and well-being through Majonzi Fund. We've also got a BAME stream project, which is mental health and well-being. Capacity building, of course, funding, of course, I've mentioned, and then the whole area of developing community spaces and enterprise. Those are kind of our priority areas. So the idea is hopefully to work with those 6 boroughs around either all or some of those priority areas going forward, and giving them support around those particular areas. There may be others, but those are things that we've kind of committed ourselves to focusing on as our key priority areas, really.
All encompassing. A very different question, but another great one. Do you have any tips or advice for being a confident leader as a Black woman when navigating and networking in circles where the majority of leaders are white?
No. Oh dear. So, the thing is, I think that, interesting question. It's very difficult to step into those spaces because, I mean, I've had all sorts of things said to me in some of those spaces, sort of people, you say things and then people don't listen to what you're actually saying and kind of answer a question, answer in a way that you, to things that you've not actually said, because they actually have assumptions about you, or they're kind of, you know, they're stereotypes. So that's really difficult. I think for me, it's just what I would say being a leader in any space, in a sense, is to be authentic, to be yourself, and actually, you know, to always, I mean, I've just always operated from a place of what they're now calling, I say they, calling generous leadership, but that's just always been my kind of way of being as a leader, to always sort of offer advice, information, networks, connections, practical opportunities, all sorts of resources that we have. I always offer those whenever I'm engaging with people. And also, I also receive lots of resources and information and tips and hints and so on. With white leaders, I just think that you just have to go in there very confident, stand your ground, know what you're talking about, you know, have some of the evidence. It's not all about facts and figures. It's also about your own lived experience and what's happening anecdotally, you know, what you're hearing anecdotally is happening. But I think just speak up. And also in terms of, you know, sort of microaggressions, which tend to be more, you know, sort of, what's the word, not apparent, but be sort of more experienced and sort of direct, you know, kind of out and out racism. I think just, you know, if somebody says something, I would just say, well, can you just repeat what you said, or did I hear you say, just to kind of make sure that,
yeah,
you know, and then kind of ask what that's about. I'm much more curious about asking questions, really, because actually, sometimes people have blind spots. Sometimes they're working from their stereotypes about Black people, you know, but actually I'm curious to find out where that's from. Because actually, if you ask a question about, you know, can you just repeat what you said, or did I hear you say, or what did you mean by that? Or then you can see the discomfort. You can see a slight sort of
yes,
body,
then know that
you
they've
know,
said something that they
yeah,
shouldn't
exactly.
be
And it's like,
saying.
oh, you know, and then that's a starter. That's a conversation starter. Yeah, it's a conversation starter. And so I'm into that kind of approach, really. But yeah, I'd also say, and you know, this goes without speaking, just know your stuff, and stand your ground. Stand your ground. Yeah, and you know, and yeah, be curious, really, in your in how you kind of intervene when you're hearing things that are, you know these things are completely off, you know. And also I'd say on outside, find where you get your support, find support networks and mechanisms and people that you can just go back and start screaming at. In Ubele, we scream all the time at what we're hearing, like, ah! You know, like, did you just see, you know, and
Yeah.
then and it's really great to have that place to scream. I know you'll be held. I know somebody will understand why you're
Yeah,
screaming. Yeah, as opposed to call you mad.
that's great. I think this probably sadly could be the final question. So sorry to everybody whose questions we've not got to. So I guess this is kind of linked to sort of the wider official COVID support that kind of, I always get lost as to where we're at with what support is available when, because it's very confusing. But there's a question, hi Yvonne, do we know how many Black companies got the bounce back loan? And I guess that kind of goes to wider things around those initial big support schemes, which all had fancy acronyms to them, which to be honest, I can't remember the acronyms for. But, you know, were there noticeable, I guess there were, but were you seeing noticeable gaps in funding and support for Black and other minority-led businesses to the official support mechanisms?
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is sort of anecdotal. I mean, in fact, it'd be interesting to look at what has actually happened, what the data says. But yeah, I've been in conversation with a colleague who's based in Croydon, and she was really sort of, she spent a lot of time over the last couple of years helping younger people who, you know, maybe had sort of experiences of being in prison or had not finished school. She'd been working with them really closely to set up businesses, and then COVID hit and everything fell apart. And she was finding that they couldn't access some of, you know, the bounce back loan offer. And so it was just devastating for them. I mean, the thing is that, you know, there's been a lot of official support, out there, but we know also support around self-employment or some of the other sort of loans that have been available. That's, you know, that's, there's one, knowing how to navigate those systems, and two, whether actually our communities meet the criteria as they're set, because they're set, you know, a long way from the reality of what's happening on the ground. My sense is that there's been, from what I've heard, and also with my colleagues who are doing the Black Business Manifesto, that actually there's been a real lack of access and enabling, and lack of being able to access these kinds of offers. And that a lot of our businesses have struggled, fallen by the wayside, and are struggling. I think it would be great if somebody could do some research through the lens of race, and race in particular, to see, but I don't know if any of the universities are doing it. I mean, I've just spent quite a few years working at Goldsmiths as well, whilst we built Ubele. But that for me is a gap. The research we're going to do around the looking at the sector generally will look at the take up of some of the schemes under Power to Change and Access UK. I know Unlimited said that they actually had, I think about 50% of the grants that they gave through their programme to social enterprises was from BAME-led businesses. So that was a first for them. That was a first. And also the Clause programme I mentioned earlier, again, that's picked up a lot of BAME groups. But I think some of the government schemes, like direct government schemes, like the bounce back loan, my sense is the take up has not been very good because of the access issues and criteria and so on. But I don't have the tangible evidence for that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to see. Yeah, if some
that's a
was
piece of
carried
research
out
that
into
needs to be done. Definitely, I can see that that's a gap.
Brilliant. And on that, I mean, we could keep on talking, really, couldn't we? Because it's really tempting. Should we just do another hour? But I guess if people wanted to get more involved, in the final question, which is kind of wrapping up anyway, but if people wanted to get more involved in the work that you do at Ubele, what's the best way people can get involved, support what you do, stay in touch?
Yeah, well then please just email us at info@ubele.org, ubele.org. And if you want to put on the heading, I'd like to talk to Yvonne Field, it will come to me. I just forward it to me. I'm like, oh, and say that you were on the webinar. But it's gonna. I'm happy to pick up the inquiry. Please do contact us. And also we have a weekly bulletin that we send out. So there's lots of information in there about grants and loans and opportunities and events and data and support and all sorts of things. So please do sign up to our Ubele bulletin. We've got a COVID-19 page on our website. And then there's the weekly bulletin and monthly newsletter. We've got some interesting events coming up. We've got events on the vaccine, to vax or not to vax. We've got some other events happening over the next few weeks. So do join us in our journey and support us if you can.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining, and thank you to everybody who. I don't know how many people we had on here, but 47, I think, was higher early on. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it was about,
thank you.
About 60 or so. But thank you so
people.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shahan. It's been great talking to you.
No worries, you too. And also a big shout out to Christopher Morgan, who's lurking. He's the other. I don't know if you can see the other screen. He's been doing the tech. So thank you, Chris, for getting it all set up.
Absolutely.
I guess.
That's great.
Well, have a good afternoon and a good weekend, everybody. Take care.